They took an Earth girl hostage. She was the wrong one. Welcome to the world of science fiction. Comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The light on Ganymede possessed a sterile, surgical quality, filtering through the triple-pane plasteel of the observation dome to spill across the library's sterile white floor in elongated rectangles. It was a cold, indifferent light, one that bleached the color from the bound spines of the ancient paper books that lined the shelves, relics from a time when information was a physical, tangible thing. Here, within the heavily fortified walls of Outpost Epsilon, cultivated an existence as quiet and ordered as the silent rows of literature surrounding her, a life of meticulously constructed fragility. To the skeleton crew of academics and military support staff who shared this isolated rock with her, she was the general's daughter, a title spoken in hushed, reverent tones, a creature of porcelain and privilege who spent her days lost in the poetry of dead languages and the philosophies of forgotten civilizations. They saw her slight frame, the cascade of dark hair that often fell across her face as she bent over a text, and the reserved, almost timid smile she offered when disturbed, and they saw a delicate flower being carefully preserved in the harsh vacuum of space, a stark contrast to the iron-willed man who was her father. This perception was not an accident but the cornerstone of a strategy so long in the making that it had become her primary reality. A second skin worn so comfortably, she sometimes forgot the steel beneath it. The heavy tome resting in her lap, a first-edition print of Thucydides' History of the War, was not merely a study in ancient conflict. It was a tactical manual whose lessons on asymmetric warfare and political deception were as relevant today against the hegemony as they had been between Athens and Sparta ago. Her deep, analytical gaze didn't just see words on a page, but tracked the flow of logistical supply lines, the devastating impact of a surprise flanking maneuver, and the critical failure point in a seemingly unbreakable alliance. All patterns she cross-referenced in her mind with the latest intelligence, reports on general sweeping campaign through the outer veil. Her reserve was not shyness but the constant, thrumming hum of situational awareness, a state of being her father had drilled into her since she could walk, where every conversation was a potential interrogation, every friendly face a possible mask, and every closed door a tactical unknown. The Ganymede outpost was her gilded cage, but the cage was of her own design, and the lock was on the inside. The carefully maintained tranquility of her world was shattered not by a sound, but by a tremor, a deep, resonant vibration that shuddered through the deck plating and set the dust motes dancing in the cold light. It was a frequency she had been trained to recognize, the distinct signature of a ship's kinetic dampeners failing to fully compensate for a non-standard atmospheric entry, a brute force arrival that cared little for stealth or subtlety. The academics in the adjacent lab might mistake it for a minor moonquake or the distant impact of a meteorite, but knew it for what it was, an uninvited guest. She heard the faint, panicked shouts from the direction of the main docking bay, the staccato rhythm of them cut short with brutal finality, followed by the high-pitched whine of plasma discharges that were not the standard issue of Earth's military forces. The outpost's internal alarm, a klaxon designed to deafen and disorient, remained silent, which was the most terrifying sign of all, signifying a breach so swift and effective that it had decapitated the command structure before a single warning could be raised. It had to be them. The hegemony was growing desperate, their fleets broken and scattered by her father's relentless hammer blows, and desperation was the mother of reckless, audacious plans. They wouldn't dare strike at the Indomitable, her father's flagship, but they would seek a different kind of leverage, a symbolic victory to wound the man they could not defeat in open battle. They were coming for the pawn, the fragile princess they believed was his only weakness. The library doors hissed open, their smooth, silent motion a jarring counterpoint to the distant, muffled sounds of violence. 4 of them entered, their forms bulky and within articulated carapaces of a polished, obsidian-like alloy that seemed to drink the light from the room. They were elite infiltrators, their movements economical and predatory, their multifaceted helmet optics glowing with a faint, crimson light as they scanned the room. Their rifles were held at a low ready, muzzles sweeping methodically across the rows of silent books, expecting threats where there were none, and ignoring the only one that mattered. They saw her, a lone figure in the center of the vast room, seemingly frozen in place, the very picture of the terrified civilian they had been briefed to expect. Two of them fanned out, securing the flanks, while the other two advanced on her position, their heavy footfalls unnaturally loud in the sudden silence. The lead commando gestured with its weapon, a silent command for her to rise, its arrogance palpable even through the full-face helmet. It was then that moved, not with the panic scramble of a victim, but with the explosive, coiled grace of a predator. In a single, fluid motion, she was on her feet, the heavy Thucydides volume held not as a shield but as a bludgeon. She didn't aim for the armored torso or the helmet, but for the knee of the closest, a spot where the obsidian plating gave way to the flexible servo actuators of the joint. The book, with its dense paper and thick leather binding, struck with the force of a battering ram, the impact producing a sickening crack of stressed metal and biological matter. The commando let out a choked, alien shriek and crumpled, its leg bending at an impossible angle. The second soldier, reacting a fraction of a second too late, brought its rifle up, but was already inside its guard, too close for the long weapon to be effective. As she had struck with the book, her other hand, which had been resting in her lap, had closed around a sharpened stylus she used for taking notes, its polymer tip honed to a monomolecular edge. She drove it upwards, not in a wild stab, but with the anatomical precision of a surgeon, aiming for the thin, unarmored gap beneath the helmet where the suit's atmospheric seals and nutrient lines connected to the user's throat. The stylus punched through the flexible material with ease, and made a wet, gurgling sound before its entire body went rigid, its own suit's emergency protocols flooding its system with medical coagulants that would, ironically, suffocate it in seconds. The two remaining commandos stood frozen for a vital heartbeat, their tactical brains struggling to process how their target, the designated non-combatant, had just neutralized half their squad in less than 3 seconds. That hesitation was all needed, though she knew this was a fight she could not win, only survive. Her objective was not to defeat them, but to sow chaos and gather information. The first one recovered, lashing out with a backhand that she partially dodged, the blow still catching her across the side of the head with enough force to send her spinning to the floor, her vision exploding in a flash of white. The last thing she felt before the world went dark was the sharp, cold prick of a needle in her neck, a high-dose sedative flooding her system, dragging her down into a black, dreamless void. As the commander hauled the limp girl over its shoulder, it keyed its internal comms, its voice a low hiss of irritation and confusion. Target secured. We met unexpected resistance. The asset is more resourceful than briefed. It glanced at its two fallen comrades, one writhing on the floor and the other unnervingly still, and then at the unconscious girl, a puzzle it could not solve. Dismissing the incident as a desperate, adrenaline-fueled fluke, a final, feral lashing out from a cornered animal, was the gravest mistake the hegemony would ever make. They brought their hostage aboard their flagship, the Star Cleaver, believing they held the key to victory, never suspecting they had just welcomed their own destruction aboard. Drifted back to consciousness on a wave of chemical fog, her thoughts sluggish and disjointed, like fragments of a shattered mirror. The first sensation was not sight or sound, but the cold, unyielding pressure of metal against her back and the dull, rhythmic thrumming of a massive starship's core vibrating through her entire body. She kept her eyes closed, her breathing deliberately slow and even, fighting the instinct to betray her returning awareness while her mind meticulously took inventory of her situation. The air she breathed was recycled, carrying the faint, ozonic tang of high-energy systems and a subtle, musky scent that was distinctly non-human, an aroma that spoke of a different biology and a hostile environment. Her wrists and ankles were bound, not with simple cuffs, but with wide, magnetic restraints that hummed with a low charge, clamped to a metallic slab that served as her bed. The sedative still clung to her synapses, a heavy shroud dulling her senses, but beneath it, the sharp, analytical mind her father had so painstakingly forged was already beginning to dissect her prison. This was not a standard brig cell designed for unruly soldiers. The clean, seamless walls and the quality of the filtered air suggested a high-security medical or containment bay, a place for valuable but dangerous assets. They still saw her as a prize, a piece on a board to be leveraged against her father, and this arrogance was the first crack in their fortress, a vulnerability she would exploit until it became a gaping wound. She cataloged the feel of the simple tunic she still wore, the faint weight of the monomolecular filament wire still hidden in its hem, a tiny, secret promise of violence in the sterile silence of her confinement. They had searched her, of course, but their scanners were calibrated for weapons, for metal, for energy signatures, and the polymer wire was designed to be invisible to all but the most invasive and intimate of examinations, a level of scrutiny they would never deem necessary for a general's pampered daughter. That was their second mistake. Aboard the bridge of the Starcleaver, War Master surveyed the holographic projections that danced in the command pit, his posture radiating an ancient, predatory confidence. He was a scion of the military aristocracy, his lineage tracing back to the first hegemony conquests, and he wore his authority like a second skin, his every gesture imbued with the certainty of a being who had never known true defeat. His crimson, multifaceted eyes flickered from the tactical display, showing the scattered remnants of an Earth patrol fleet to the placid, blue-green orb of a nearby gas giant, a silent testament to his ship's overwhelming power. The capture of the girl had been executed with an almost insulting ease, the loss of 2 commandos an insignificant price for the checkmate move he was about to make. He signaled his communications officer, a lean, cautious, whose antennae twitched with nervous energy. Open a channel. System-wide broadcast Priority 1 encryption, route it directly to the command frequency of the Earth flagship. Indomitable commanded, his voice a low rasp that cut through the bridge's quiet hum. And bring the asset online. I want the general to see exactly what he stands to lose. A section of the main holographic display flickered, then resolved into a live feed from Cell, showing her still form, the picture of helpless fragility. Allowed himself a moment of satisfaction, a predator savoring the scent of its trapped prey. The broadcast went live, his face filling the screens of every ship in the sector. "General," he began, his voice dripping with condescending magnanimity, "I am War Master of the hegemony. We have in our possession something of great value to you." The view shifted to, her face pale in the cell's cold light. "Your daughter, a lovely, if surprisingly spirited, young woman. Her continued health and safe return are contingent on your immediate and unconditional compliance. Cease all military operations. Withdraw your fleets from the Cerberus, Elysium, and Tartarus systems. Cede control of the Janus relay. You have 1 standard cycle to confirm your acceptance. Refuse, and you will watch as we extinguish your bloodline piece by piece across every comm channel in the galaxy." He concluded his speech and cut the feed, the bridge of the Starcleaver filled with the smug, triumphant silence of a war already won. Miles away, cloaked in the silent darkness of deep space, the bridge of the Indomitable was a cathedral of tension. General's command staff, a collection of the most hardened and experienced officers in Earth's military, stood like statues at their stations, their faces grim masks as they watched the broadcast on their main. They saw the alien commander's arrogant posture, and they saw the image of their leader's daughter, vulnerable and alone in an enemy ship, and a cold dread settled over them. They knew the general's reputation for ruthless pragmatism, but this was his own flesh and blood, a line they thought even he would not cross. They awaited the inevitable order to stand down, to pull back the fleets that were, at that very moment, poised to deliver a crushing blow to the hegemony's logistical network. General himself stood motionless before the screen, his hands clasped behind his back, his expression as unreadable as a slab of granite. He watched the entire broadcast without a single flicker of emotion, his gaze fixed on his daughter's image, not with the anguish of a father, but with the critical eye of a strategist assessing a key piece on the board. Once ultimatum ended and the screen went black, the silence on the bridge became a crushing weight. Turned slowly, his gaze sweeping over his anxious officers. He walked to his command chair, the only sound the soft click of his boots on the deck plating. Instead of activating the fleet-wide comms, he signaled his personal communications officer. Send a single, encrypted burst directly to the flagship, text only. His voice was unnervingly calm, a low, resonant baritone that carried more menace than any shout. He dictated the message, each word falling like a drop of ice. You have taken something that does not belong to you, and you will pay the price for it, all of you. Then he turned to his tactical officer, his voice hardening into the familiar, unyielding tone of command that had conquered a dozen worlds. Execute Campaign Plan Omega, all fleets, full and immediate advance, no quarter, no retreat. A collective, invisible shockwave passed through the command staff. They had expected retreat, negotiation, anything but this. This was not the act of a grieving father. It was the cold, merciless calculus of a god of war, and they suddenly felt a chilling premonition that they had not captured a hostage, but had instead willingly swallowed a poison pill. The general's reply arrived on the Starcleaver's bridge like a physical blow, a string of cold, alien text scrolling across the main screen in place of the expected surrender. War Master stared at it, his multifaceted optics widening in disbelief before narrowing into slits of pure fury. He reread the words, the sheer audacity of the human's defiance a personal insult that transcended military strategy. This was not how the game was played. Civilized empires understood the value of bloodlines, the sanctity of a leader's progeny. To so callously discard his own daughter was an act of barbarism he could not comprehend, an illogical, insane response that threw his carefully laid plans into disarray. He's bluffing, hissed, more to himself than to his crew, his antennae vibrating with rage. A pathetic attempt to project strength. He thinks to call my hand. But even as he said it, new intelligence reports began flooding the tactical displays, red icons flaring to life as generals' fleets, far from withdrawing, surged forward with renewed aggression, striking deep into hegemony territory with a speed and ferocity that spoke not of bluffing, but of total, unrestrained war. The human wasn't just continuing his campaign. He was accelerating it, using the ultimatum as a trigger for an even deadlier phase of his assault. His mind reeled trying to process the unthinkable. The human was willing to sacrifice his child. The rage cooled into a cold, simmering hatred. The girl was no longer a bargaining chip. She was an insult to be disposed of, a symbol of her father's madness. Double the guard on the prisoner, he snarled at his security chief. But maintain standard protocols. I will not waste elite resources on a piece of flesh her own father has thrown away. She will be dealt with in due time, and her end will be broadcast for her father's viewing pleasure. He turned his attention back to the unfolding disaster on the tactical map, his mind now consumed with Blunting's unexpected offensive, completely dismissing the seemingly insignificant girl in his hold, failing to see that the real offensive was not happening out in the cold void of space, but was about to begin deep within the heart of his own ship. In her cell, the last vestiges of the sedative finally burned away, leaving his mind as sharp and clear as a shard of glass. The apathetic grogginess was replaced by a cold, controlled energy, her father's voice echoing in the depths of her memory. Emotion is a current that can power you or drown you. Let your enemies drown in theirs. You will be the rock they break against. She flexed her fingers, testing the strength of the magnetic cuffs. They were powerful, designed to hold a creature much stronger than a human, but they were also rigid, their design lacking the nuanced flexibility that a more advanced race might have employed. She focused on her right hand, the hand of a scholar, a musician, a girl who had never known a day of hard labor. It was also the hand that her father's most brutal training instructor had systematically broken and reset 3 times to teach her the true meaning of pain and the limits of her own body. Pushing through the flaring protest of her nerves, began the excruciatingly painful process of dislocating her own thumb. She forced the bone from its socket with a sickening, silent pop, the wave of white-hot agony, a familiar fire that she embraced and controlled. The new, unnatural flexibility of her hand gave her just enough clearance to begin sliding it out from under the restraint, the magnetic field fighting her, scraping her skin raw against the cold metal. It took an eternity of gritted teeth and silent, focused effort, but finally her hand slipped free. She lay still for a moment, letting the pain subside into a dull throb before reaching for the hem of her simple tunic. Her fingers found the reinforced seam, and with a surgeon's delicacy, she pulled the hidden thread, releasing the thin, coiled filament of monomolecular wire. It was barely visible in the dim light, a whisper of a weapon, but in her hands, it was the key that would unlock this entire fortress. With her thumb now relocated with another gut-wrenching twist, she wrapped the wire around her fingers and approached the electronic lock on her cell door, her reflection a pale ghost in the polished metal, her eyes no longer holding the feigned terror of a hostage, but the cold, predatory focus of a saboteur. The game had begun. The lock on her cell door was a marvel of engineering, a seamless plate of energized metal with no visible keyhole or external mechanism, designed to be opened only by a specific frequency broadcast from a guard's control unit. 2, however, it was merely a complex circuit waiting to be shorted. She pressed her ear against the cold metal, the monomolecular filament held taut between her fingers, and listened to the faint, high-frequency hum of the locking field. Her father had taught her that every system, no matter how advanced, has a flaw born from the assumptions of its creators, and this primary assumption was that no one would be audacious or skilled enough to tamper with the circuitry from the inside. She slid the filament into the microscopic gap between the door and its frame, a space no thicker than a hair, until she felt the faint magnetic resistance of the primary power conduit. With a surgeon's precision, she manipulated the wire, bypassing the primary security loop and creating a direct, raw connection to the actuator's release command, causing the internal mechanism to overload with a soft, final click. The door slid open with a gentle hiss, revealing an empty, white corridor, starkly illuminated by glowing panels in the ceiling. She didn't run. She dissolved into the ship, melting into the shadows and moving with a fluid silence that was more terrifying than any battle cry. Her destination was not the escape pods or the hangar bay, for escape was a secondary concern, a mere consequence of her primary mission. Her target was the ship's nervous system, its vast network of maintenance shafts and power conduits, the forgotten spaces between the decks where she could turn the vessel from a fortress into a tomb for its own crew. She found an access hatch behind a sanitation unit, its cover sealed with standard magnetic bolts that she quickly disengaged with a targeted pulse from her filament wire, and slipped into the tight, dimly lit beyond, the world of polished corridors and military order giving way to a labyrinth of humming cables and hissing pipes. Her campaign of terror began not with an explosion, but with a whisper of failing systems. Deep within the crew barracks on decks 7 through 9, she located a series of environmental control substations, the nodes responsible for regulating the delicate balance of oxygen, nitrogen, and trace elements that are required for respiration. She didn't shut them down entirely, as that would trigger immediate ship-wide alarms. Instead, she introduced subtle corruptions into their programming, a slow, incremental reduction in oxygen levels, and a corresponding increase in carbon dioxide, so gradual that the ship's atmospheric sensors would register it as a minor, correctable malfunction. The crew, finishing their duty cycles, would return to their quarters feeling an unusual lethargy, a dull headache they would attribute to fatigue from the recent high alert status. Their cognitive functions would slow, their reaction times would lengthen, and a pervasive sense of malaise would settle over a significant portion of the ship's fighting force, all without a single shot being fired. From there, she moved deeper into the ship's bowels, towards the colossal plasma conduits that fed the primary drive and weapon systems. She found an exposed maintenance junction in the heart of the engineering section, a place of immense heat and thrumming power. Using the ship's own diagnostic tools accessed through a secondary terminal, she created a series of cascading error reports, convincing the ship's automated maintenance protocols that a critical pressure buildup was imminent. The system, designed to vent such pressure into deep space, was tricked by her rerouted commands into shunting a jet of superheated plasma not into the void, but into the adjacent waste reclamation center, incinerating two unlucky technicians who were investigating what they believed to be a faulty garbage compactor. The event was logged as a catastrophic but accidental system failure, a one-in-a-million tragedy that sent a ripple of unease through the engineering crew, forcing them to divert critical manpower to run redundant safety checks on systems that were, in fact, perfectly stable. On the bridge, War Master watched the reports of system malfunctions with a growing sense of irritation, his earlier triumphant mood curdling into frustration. A minor atmospheric flaw in the barracks, a tragic but explainable plasma conduit rupture in engineering, and now a series of inexplicable power surges that had knocked out the sanitation drones on the lower decks, causing them to behave erratically, bumping into walls and spraying cleaning fluid at startled crew members. His security chief reported these incidents with a tone of beleaguered apology, attributing them to the strain put on the ship's systems by the constant state of high alert and the ongoing battle maneuvers against inexplicably aggressive fleet. Wanted to agree, to dismiss it all as the consequence of war, but the sheer number of disconnected, random failures pricked at his strategic mind. It felt less like a ship under strain and more like a body succumbing to a subtle, creeping disease. The final piece of the puzzle that refused to fit was General's continued suicidal offensive. His fleets were not just attacking, they were systematically dismantling the hegemony's outer defenses with a precision that suggested an impossible level of intelligence, striking at supply depots and communication relays whose locations were known only to the highest echelons of command. It made no sense, unless wasn't trying to save his daughter, unless the girl was never the true objective. A cold, unsettling thought began to form in the back of his mind, a thought so outlandish he almost dismissed it, the idea that a single, non-combatant human could be the source of his ship's problems. Yet, he couldn't shake the image of the two elite commandos she had disabled back on Ganymede, an event he had so foolishly dismissed as a fluke. "Full security lockdown," he commanded, his voice sharp enough to make his bridge officers flinch. "I want a deck-by-deck sweep, every corridor, every maintenance shaft. Seal all sections. I'm no longer convinced these are accidents. I suspect we have been boarded. Find them." He still believed he was hunting a team of Earth's most elite special forces, phantoms who had somehow slipped through his security net, never once suspecting that his entire quarry was a single teenage girl moving through his ship with the silent grace of a ghost. Felt the shift in the ship's state immediately as heavy blast doors sealed off entire sections and internal security fields hummed to life. The lockdown, meant to trap the invaders, only confirmed to her that her strategy was working, that she had successfully cultivated enough chaos to force the commander's hand. She was now a virus in a quarantine system, but the quarantine had come too late. Her quiet war of sabotage had not been random acts of vandalism. Each move had been a carefully calculated step, a diversion to mask her true, inexorable path towards the ship's heart. Deep within the most heavily fortified section of the vessel, protected by layers of electromagnetic shielding and sentient security software, lay her ultimate prize. It was not the bridge, nor the reactor core, but a silent, cold chamber known as the central data core. As she bypassed the final layers of security, crawling through a ventilation shaft that overlooked the chamber, she saw it for the first time. It was a massive, crystalline structure, glowing with a soft, internal light, pulses of data visibly flowing through its intricate matrix like blood through a living heart. This was far more than just the ship's operational database. This was the Starcleaver's secret cargo, the reason for its deployment so close to the front lines. Her father's intelligence had been correct. In their arrogance, believing their flagship to be untouchable, had used it to transport the single most valuable asset in their entire empire. A complete, unencrypted copy of the hegemony's royal archive. Within that glowing crystal was every secret they possessed. The precise coordinates of their hidden shipyards churning out new fleets, the locations of their emergency command bunkers, the genetic codes of their ruling council, and most importantly, the closely guarded, almost mythical location of their home world, Prime, a secret they had protected for 1,000 years of conquest. Her abduction was never about her father's reaction. It was an infiltration vector, a contingency plan of breathtaking audacity she and her father had designed years ago. She was not a pawn to be ransomed. She was the dagger aimed at the hegemony's very soul. Her mission was not to escape. It was to steal their future. The hunt for the Phantom sabotage team was proving to be a catastrophic failure, a spiral of frustration and mounting casualties that gnawed at War Master's authority. His elite guard teams, sweeping through the lockdown corridors, found nothing but their own dead, victims of what seemed to be a ship turning violently against itself. They reported finding sealed sections with the atmosphere mysteriously vented, maintenance alcoves filled with lethal levels of coolant gas, and automated cargo lifters that had seemingly gone haywire, crushing anyone in their path. The invaders left no footprints, no energy signatures, no biological traces. They were ghosts, and the Starcleaver was their hunting ground. Standing on his bridge, which felt less like a command center, and more like the skull of a dying beast, finally reached the end of his patience. He shoved past his bewildered security chief and stormed towards the ship's central security nexus, a secluded deck where every available scrap of data was processed. He would find the source of this infection himself, tearing the ship's memory apart piece by piece if he had to, because the cold, terrifying suspicion that had taken root in his mind was now growing into a monstrous certainty that was far more frightening than any ghost fleet of commandos. He dismissed the frantic reports from the front line, where generals' forces were carving through his defenses with surgical precision, because he knew, with the chilling instinct of a cornered predator, that the real war was not out there in the void but right here, within the hull of his own flagship. He began his search not where the chaos was now, but where it had started, demanding his technicians retrieve the raw, uncorrupted security logs from the high-security medical bay where the human girl had been held. The logs were clean, showing the two guards standing watch, their patrol patterns undisturbed, until the moment the cell door inexplicably slid open and the girl was gone. From there, it was a painstaking process of following a trail of digital breadcrumbs, linking fragmented data streams from damaged sensors and corrupted camera feeds. He saw a flicker of movement in a maintenance, a momentary power drain in a junction box that perfectly coincided with a life support failure 2 decks above, a shadow that moved too quickly to be an equipment malfunction. He worked backwards from each accident, cross-referencing them with the ship's schematics, his multifaceted eyes darting across a dozen holographic screens, a grim tapestry of his ship's slow demise. The breakthrough came from a single, damaged optical sensor in a plasma conduit relay station, the one that had vented its lethal contents into the waste reclamation center. The primary feed was gone, wiped by the energy surge, but a secondary diagnostic sensor had captured 4 seconds of corrupted footage before it failed. His technicians worked frantically to reconstruct the data, and after an agonizing wait, the image resolved on the main screen. It was grainy, flickering, and distorted by energy waves, but it was unmistakable. It was the girl, not cowering or running but moving with the cold, efficient grace of a master saboteur, her hands deftly manipulating a control panel's internal wiring with a thin, glowing filament, her face a mask of intense concentration. The truth, in its full, horrifying absurdity, crashed down on with the force of a physical blow. There was no sabotage team. There were no ghosts. There was only her. A wave of ice-cold dread washed over him, a feeling he had not experienced since he was a frightened larva in the spawning pits. Every single event, every malfunction, every death, was the work of one human female he had dismissed as little more than baggage. The subtle atmospheric poisoning, the plasma conduit rupture, the deranged sanitation drones, it was all her. She had been playing with them, dissecting his ship and his crew with the detached curiosity of a biologist studying an ant farm, and he, the great war master, had been the lead ant. His mind raced, reevaluating everything he knew, every assumption he had made. The initial resistance on Ganymede, her father's impossibly callous response, the surgical precision of the Earth Fleet's assault, it all snapped into a single, terrifying picture. She hadn't been a hostage, she had been delivered. And if she was this capable, her objective could not simply be chaos. A saboteur of her skill would have a singular, critical objective, the one target that would inflict the most damage, the one prize worthy of such an audacious gamble. His blood ran cold as he realized what it was. The Royal Archive. He didn't wait to confirm his theory. He slammed his fist onto the Master Comms panel, bypassing his entire chain of command. All remaining elite forces converge on the central data core immediately. Lethal force is authorized. The target is the human prisoner. Seal the sector and kill her on sight. His voice was a raw shriek of fury and dawning panic. He began sprinting from the security nexus himself, his ceremonial officer's blade drawn and humming with energy, his mind no longer on strategy or victory, but on the primal, desperate need to exterminate the creature that had so thoroughly and completely outmaneuvered him. Felt the ship's security posture shift from a wide search pattern to a focused, targeted convergence on her position. She had the data, a torrent of information so vast it was currently being compressed in her portable slicer unit, the secrets of an entire empire condensed into a package small enough to be broadcast. The download from the crystalline archive was complete, but now she needed an antenna powerful enough to pierce the jamming fields and transmit the data to the Indomitable. Her target was the primary communications hub, a massive chamber 2 decks above, filled with broadcasting arrays capable of reaching across the entire star system. As she moved through the service conduits, she could hear the thunder of armored boots and the shouted commands of the guards closing in, their movements no longer a sweep but a direct assault. She emerged into the communications hub, a cavernous space dominated by a massive, central spire that was the heart of the ship's comms array, surrounded by humming consoles and power conduits that pulsed with a visible blue energy. She plugged her slicer into the master control panel, initiating the final sequence that would hijack the entire array and turn it into her personal broadcast station. The compression was almost complete. She just needed a few more seconds. The heavy blast doors at the far end of the chamber exploded inwards, torn from their hinges, and War Master himself stormed into the room, flanked by the last of his royal guard, their plasma rifles leveled and glowing with lethal intent. He saw her, a small, lone figure standing by the master console, and for a moment he saw a flicker of what he could only interpret as pure, unadulterated terror on her face, the look of a cornered animal finally facing the predator. The sight filled him with a surge of vengeful satisfaction. He had her. "There is nowhere left to run, little ghost," he snarled, his voice echoing in the vast chamber. "Your game is over." He gestured forward with his blade. "Take her." The guards advanced, their steps heavy and confident, forming a closing semicircle around her. The look on his face, however, was not terror. It was the feigned panic of a hunter who had just lured the prey into the perfect position. Her hand, which had been resting on the console, slammed down on the final activation command. It was a trap she had prepared the moment she chose the communications hub as her broadcast point. Her work in the engineering decks hadn't just been random chaos. She had rerouted a massive amount of power from the secondary plasma conduits, not to the weapons or the drive, but directly to the comms array, overloading its capacity 100-fold. But instead of channeling that power into the antenna, she had redirected it through the massive induction plates laid beneath the chamber's conductive deck plating. As guards marched across the floor, unleashed the stored energy in one titanic surge. It was not a subtle attack. It was a raw, overwhelming tsunami of power. The air crackled with ozone, and the deck plates glowed with a blinding white light. The armored guards collapsed as one, their bodies convulsing violently as their advanced suits were instantly and catastrophically short-circuited. The sophisticated electronics that made them deadly warriors turned into their own executioners. Blue emergency lights strobed to life as the primary lighting failed, plunging the chamber into a ghastly, flickering twilight. The smell of burned metal and ozone filled the air. War Master stood frozen in the doorway, his own blade sparking and dying in his hand, the feedback loop having fried its power cell. He was alone, his elite guard twitching on the electrified floor around him, staring in stunned disbelief at the teenage girl who now turned from the console to face him, the feigned terror in her eyes replaced by a look as cold and empty as the void itself. The blue emergency lights cast long, dancing shadows across the chamber of broken bodies, painting the scene in hues of sapphire and black, a grotesque tableau of failed conquest. War Master stood paralyzed in the doorway, the stench of ozone and superheated metal filling his senses, his mind utterly unable to bridge the gap between the fragile human child he had captured and the master strategist who had just single-handedly dismantled his command. The silence that followed the surge of power was more profound than any explosion, broken only by the crackle of dying electronics and the distant, groaning shriek of a starship tearing itself apart. Watched him from across the chamber, her slicer unit now emitting a steady, calm chime, signaling that the compressed royal archive had been successfully broadcast, a dagger of pure information piercing the heart of the hegemony from light years away. She gave no sign of triumph, her expression remaining one of cold, dispassionate focus, her duty now shifting from sabotage and espionage to the final, pragmatic act of survival. Finally moved, not with the aggression of a warrior, but with the shambling gait of a broken being, taking a single, hesitant step into the chamber before his legs gave way, and he fell to his knees amidst his fallen guard, his useless ceremonial blade clattering onto the electrified deck. His multifaceted eyes, which had surveyed entire systems with arrogant disdain, were now fixed on her, filled with a dawning, soul-crushing comprehension that was 1,000 times more painful than any physical wound. He had not merely been defeated. He had been rendered obsolete, a relic of a form of warfare that was no match for the cold, human calculus that had been deployed against him. A deep, shuddering tremor ran through the entire vessel, far more violent than any before, as a critical failure cascaded through the primary reactor, a final, delayed gift from earlier work in the engineering decks. Red alert klaxons, shrill and desperate, began to blare in concert with the strobing blue lights, a frantic symphony for a dying ship. Knew her time was limited. She gave one last, dismissive glance before turning her back on him, a gesture of ultimate contempt, and sprinting from the communications hub, not towards the main corridors, but back into the service conduits that were her domain. The ship around her was now actively trying to kill her, its automated damage control system sealing bulkheads at random, venting atmosphere from compromised sections, and spraying fire suppression foam that could suffocate a person in seconds. It was a race against the machine's death throes, a chaotic obstacle course where every turn presented a new, lethal threat. She navigated the collapsing labyrinth with a focused intensity, her mind processing the ship's schematic, her father's lessons on catastrophic system failures, and the groaning protests of the dying vessel into a single, viable escape route. She emerged into a cargo bay just as a series of explosive decompressions ripped through the upper decks, the force tearing a gaping hole in the ship's outer hull, exposing the silent, stardusted void. The bay's emergency flickered to life, the only thing holding the remaining atmosphere in place, and through the shimmering barrier of energy, she could see the distant, beautiful, and terrifying spectacle of General's fleet, no longer just attacking, but executing a coordinated, system-wide decapitation strike based on the data she had just delivered, their weapons' fire blooming like silent flowers against the backdrop of enemy ships that were now, effectively, blind and defenseless. The escape pod bay was just beyond the cargo hold, but her path was blocked by a handful of surviving crewmen, not elite guards, but terrified engineers and logistics officers armed with plasma pistols, their faces a mixture of fear and vengeful rage. They saw her, the human ghost responsible for their doom, and they opened fire, their shots wild and inaccurate in their panic. Didn't engage them directly. Instead, she dived behind a massive, unsecured cargo container, her hand striking the container's magnetic lock release panel. As the panic advanced on her position, she kicked the panel, and the container, its mag clamps disengaged, began to slide across the deck, propelled by the ship's violent lurching. The crewmen, caught off guard, were swept aside by the multi-ton block of metal, their cries cut short as they were crushed against the far bulkhead. Didn't wait to see the outcome. She was already moving, vaulting over the sliding container and sprinting towards the escape pod bay. She reached the launch tubes, slamming her hand on the activation panel of the nearest pod, its hatch hissing open to reveal a cramped, Spartan interior. As she climbed inside, she took one last look back at the chaos of the dying Starcleaver, a monument to arrogance and her own terrifying competence. The pod ejected with a gut-wrenching lurch. A tiny fleck of matter spat out from the gargantuan, mortally wounded warship just as its reactor finally breached its containment field. The Starcleaver did not merely explode. It was erased from existence in a flash of silent, white light so brilliant it momentarily the nearby stars, a fittingly absolute end for the vessel that had carried the seeds of its own destruction. Her escape pod drifted in the silent void for less than a minute. The space before her seemed to shimmer and warp, and then a ship materialized from the darkness, a small, matte black Earth stealth vessel with no markings and an engine signature so low it was practically non-existent. A tractor beam, gentle and precise, enveloped her pod and drew it into an open hangar bay. The moment the pod's hatch opened, the air of the hangar felt clean and familiar, a stark contrast to the alien musk of the ship. A figure was waiting for her, standing alone in the center of the bay, his posture ramrod straight, his face as impassive as ever. General. The reunion was not one of tearful embraces or relieved cries. It was the quiet, profound acknowledgement between two masters of a deadly craft who had just executed a flawless operation. He simply looked at her, his gaze sweeping over her, not checking for injuries but assessing her state, her composure, her readiness. Met his gaze and gave a single, almost imperceptible nod, a silent report that the mission was complete. He gestured towards the bridge, and they walked side by side, two shadows against the stark military functionality of the ship. On the main, a real-time tactical map showed the full extent of their victory. The hegemony was in a state of terminal collapse. Armed with the Royal Archive, fleets had bypassed every fortress, every fleet, and struck directly at the hegemony's command and control structures. Their primary shipyards were burning, their command bunkers were being systematically cracked open, and a task force was already en route to the previously secret coordinates of Prime, not to conquer it, but to enforce the terms of an unconditional surrender that was now inevitable. The hegemony will cease to exist as a galactic power by the end of the week, General stated, not as a boast but as a simple, undeniable fact. He then turned his full attention to his daughter, and for the first time, the cold, calculating strategist in his eyes was joined by a flicker of something else, a deep, abiding respect that was more meaningful than any paternal affection he could have shown. "You did well." She replied with another simple nod, The grim satisfaction of a job perfectly executed her only reward. The galaxy, which had once whispered in fear of the Iron General, would now have a new legend to tell in hushed tones. The story of the ghost of the Star Cleaver, the girl they took hostage, who turned out not to be the pawn in their game, but the hand that swept the board clean.